She smiled and wished him well, exactly as she had to everyone else. That was the problem. The Duke of Calverley sat motionless on his horse, and could not understand why her easy farewell had landed like a verdict. She had treated him exactly as she treated the farrier, the curate, The Duke of Calverley sat motionless on his horse at the end of the gravel lane, the reins slack in his left hand, the plain gold signet ring on his right catching a slant of early light. Behind him, the Flood farmhouse grew smaller, and the woman in the doorway had already turned back inside because she had bread to shape and a day to get on with, and Edmund Ashworth was, to her, no more remarkable than any other man who had come to the door and gone again. His valet, Phipps, a careful, thin-wristed man who had served him 11 years and prided himself on reading the Duke's moods the way a fisherman reads weather, sat his own horse 2 lengths behind and said nothing. But he noted it. He noted the absolute silence. Not the Duke's habitual quiet, which was a practiced, elegant instrument, a kind of courtesy made from distance. This was different. This was the silence of a man whose interior architecture had just been rearranged without his permission, and who did not yet know where the walls had fallen. Phipps had seen the Duke refuse an earl's daughter with such gentleness that she thanked him afterward. He had seen him sit through 4 hours of parliamentary debate without shifting in his chair. He had seen him sign away 600 acres to settle his dead father's debts and then eat supper with a steady hand. He had never seen the Duke unable to speak. They rode 3 miles before Edmund so much as adjusted his grip on the reins, and by then Phipps had concluded, with the quiet certainty of a man who knows his employer better than any living soul, that something irreversible had happened at that farmhouse. Something that could not be unsigned, unread, or returned to its envelope. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Stories like this one do not begin at the end, however much the heart might wish to skip the difficult middle. They begin in the place where the wound was made, because the wound is the door, and a man must walk through it before he can walk out. 3 weeks before that morning, the Duke of Calverley had not yet learned that a woman could undo him simply by treating him as ordinary. What Edmund had learned instead, learned early and learned deep, the way a burn teaches a hand about the stove, was that affection is performance. His father's second wife, a woman of considerable beauty and meticulous cunning, had courted Edmund's trust for 2 full years after her marriage to the old Duke. She had remembered his birthday. She had asked after his reading. She had wept convincingly at his commission into the regiment. And the month the old Duke died, she had presented forged debts totaling £14,000 against the estate and vanished to the continent with every shilling the executors released before the fraud was discovered. £14,000. That is what Edmund Ashworth's belief in unpurchased kindness had cost him. He never got the money back. He got the lesson instead, and he held it the way he held that signet ring, worn smooth, close to the bone, never removed. So he built his wall, and it was a beautiful wall, understand. £11,000 a year and a 40-room townhouse in Mayfair gave a man excellent materials. He attended every ball. He answered every invitation. He was so precisely courteous that no one could fault him, and no one could reach him. And the women who pursued him, and they did pursue him, because a Duke of 34 with gray-green eyes and a jaw like that is not left alone by the world, found themselves charmed, flattered, and deposited gently back on the far side of an invisible line they had not seen him draw. He wanted nothing that could refuse him. That was the trick. Want nothing alive, nothing willful, nothing that might say yes today and strip the walls tomorrow. It worked. It worked so well it nearly killed him. But it worked. Then Lady Phoebe wrote. His great-aunt's letter arrived in June, penned in her sharp, leftward-leaning hand, on paper that smelled faintly of camphor and sheer authority. She was at Hartlow, a borrowed manor house in Wiltshire. Her health, she wrote, required his presence for the summer. The word required was underlined twice, which, in Lady Phoebe's epistolary grammar, meant she was not asking. Her health, it should be noted, was perfect. It had been perfect for 82 years. Lady Phoebe Ashworth had buried 2 husbands, 6 physicians, and every person who had ever predicted she would not last the winter. She wore 3 shawls, not because she was frail, but because she liked the weight of them. And she kept an ivory-handled walking stick with a silver ferrule, not for support, but because it was useful for pointing at things that displeased her, which was most things. Edmund went. He went because she was the only person left in his family who had never lied to him, and because refusing Lady Phoebe was, on the whole, more exhausting than obeying her. Hartlow was a house of 30 rooms and leaking ceilings, borrowed from a baron who had decamped to Italy and left behind more debt than furniture. Edmund arrived expecting chaos. What he found instead was order. Quiet, ruthless, improbable order. The floors were swept. The windows were clean. His room had fresh linen and a fire laid, and the whole place smelled of beeswax and dried lavender and competence. A staff of 4. 4 people ran this house, and at the center of them, directing everything with the economy of motion that a general would envy, was a woman in a faded sage-green dress with mended cuffs, a cream linen apron, and sturdy brown half-boots scuffed at the toes. Margaret Flood. Maggie. A local woman of no family, no fortune, and no visible interest in explaining herself to anyone, least of all a duke. She was introduced. She did not curtsy. She did not blush. She did not pause in folding the cloth in her hands. She told him supper was at 7, his room was the east chamber, and the chimney smoked if the wind came from the north. She said, "Your Grace," exactly once. Like a toll paid at a gate she did not intend to pass through again. And after that she called him Sir, the same way she called everyone Sir. From her chair by the window, Lady Phoebe watched her great-nephew's face over the rim of her pince-nez. One pale blue eye narrowed, the small round birthmark on her right cheekbone catching the last of the afternoon light. She said nothing. She adjusted the cameo brooch at her throat. She rested one thin hand on the ivory handle of her stick. But the narrator can tell you, she was already satisfied. The morning after she did not curtsy, Margaret Flood rose at 5:30, as she had every morning for the past 4 years, and began the work of keeping a crumbling house upright on almost nothing. Let me give you the numbers, because the numbers are the spine of this woman's life, and if you don't feel them in your teeth, you won't understand a single thing that follows. Maggie earned £18 a year managing Hartlow for Lady Phoebe. 18. That is less than a middling footman collects in a great house. And she was running the whole operation. Accounts, provisions, linens, fires, correspondence, the garden, the leaking roof in the east wing that she'd patched herself with tar and canvas the previous autumn because the roofer wanted £2 she did not have. On top of that, she kept 12 hives of bees along the south wall of the orchard, and their honey brought her an additional £3, 10 shillings in a good year, sold in jars she sealed and labeled in her own hand. She sewed mending for 3 households in the village at a penny apiece. She taught 4 young women their letters on Tuesday and Thursday mornings in the kitchen for nothing, because someone had taught her, and she considered the debt unpaid until she died. She owned one good dress. You've seen it, the sage green cotton with the mended cuffs and the braided cord belt. That was the dress. There was no other. And here is the fact that makes all those other facts into a story. Her father had lost the family freehold, a small farm called Flood Cottage 7 years earlier, to a man named Mr. George Pallister, a solicitor in Devizes who held the mortgage and had been collecting rent on the place ever since. Pallister, sandy-haired, soft through the middle, chin so weak he hid it behind a high-starched collar, had smiled pleasantly through every stage of that theft, because that is what men like Pallister do. They smile. They consult their gold pocket watches. They say things like, "I'm sure you understand, it's simply business," while they strip a family to the bone and walk away with the marrow in their pocket. Flood Cottage sat 3 miles from Hartlow, and Maggie could see its chimney from the orchard if she stood on the stile, and she never stood on the stile. That was the woman Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Calverley, watched through his first full day at Hartlow. And what unsettled him was not her poverty, though it was visible in every mended seam and careful economy. What unsettled him was her competence, and the fact that it required absolutely nothing from him. She fed the household, a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and cold ham, with the efficient grace of a woman who has calculated the cost of every slice. She managed the accounts in a ledger she kept in the kitchen dresser, and Edmund, passing through, caught a glimpse of her handwriting, small, even, precise, steadier than anything his steward in Yorkshire had ever produced. She spoke to the dairyman at the back door with direct warmth. She spoke to the girl who came to collect mending with the same warmth. She spoke to Edmund when he asked where he might find ink with exactly the same tone, not cold, not rude, simply undifferentiated. He was a man in the house who needed ink, and she told him where the ink was and returned to her ledger. He had £11,000 a year. She did not care. That evening, a neighboring gentleman called Sir William Hatch arrived for dinner, a ruddy, agreeable man of 60 with a loud laugh and an easy manner. Maggie served the table herself, setting each dish with quick, sure hands, and when Sir William asked after her bees, she answered with the same easy friendliness she'd shown the dairyman, the mending girl, the Duke. Edmund watched this exchange from behind his wineglass, and something jolted through him that he could not immediately name. It sat in his chest like a stone he'd accidentally swallowed. Her manner to Sir William was identical to her manner to him, not warmer, not cooler, not adjusted by a single degree for the difference in rank or fortune or anything else the world considered worth adjusting for. He was not special in her house. He was simply present. The stone did not move.
After dinner, Lady Phoebe settled into her chair by the fire, all three shawls, the ivory-handled walking stick propped against the arm, her pale blue eyes glittering behind the pince-nez she'd let drop to her chest. She accepted her wine from Edmund's hand and regarded him with the angular alertness of a woman who had been reading men's faces since before his father was born. "Do you find Mrs. Flood capable?" she asked, as if the question were about the weather. Edmund, standing by the mantel with his hands clasped behind his back and his gold signet ring catching the firelight, said that he did. Lady Phoebe lifted one sparse white brow. "She is the most capable woman in 40 miles, and the poorest. And those two facts are connected, and you are not clever enough yet to see how."
Edmund changed the subject to the condition of the road from Marlborough. Phoebe led him. She always let a man retreat the first time. It was the second time she didn't allow. Near midnight, Edmund lay in his room staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the house settle around him, and could not sleep. The stone in his chest had not dissolved. He rose, pulled on his boots, and descended the narrow stairs to the kitchen. The door was ajar. A single tallow candle burned on the table. And there on the stone floor, on her knees, was Maggie Flood, with a borrowed awl in one hand and a broken kitchen chair turned on its side before her. She was resetting the leg joint, working the wood with patient, practiced force, her honey-blonde hair half fallen from its twist, the brass thimble she kept in her apron pocket set beside her on the flags like a talisman. She did not look up when he entered. She did not stop working. The village carpenter charged 4 shillings. She did not have 4 shillings. Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Calverley, stood in that doorway with his £11,000 a year, and his dark chestnut hair and his gray-green eyes, and his precisely tied cravat, now loosened at the throat, and he watched a woman fix a chair because she could not afford not to. And something in his understanding of the world shifted by a single, irreversible degree. And he could not speak. And he did not speak. And the candle burned between them like a question neither of them had learned how to ask. The next morning, Edmund offers, carefully, formally, with the measured stride of a man who has rehearsed his words twice before breakfast, to have the chair repaired by his own man. He phrases it as a matter of household maintenance. He phrases it as something owed, something practical, something that has nothing whatsoever to do with the image of her sitting alone at midnight with a chisel and a stub of candle. He is, in short, a man trying to disguise a kindness as an obligation, and Maggie Flood sees through him the way lantern light passes through muslin. She thanks him. Her tone is immaculate. She says the chair's already mended, which it is. She finished it herself some time before dawn, the joints newly glued, the leg reset with a dowel she shaped from a piece of scrap oak. She says this without pride and without apology, and then she returns to her work, which this morning involves inventorying the linens, and her hands move across the folded sheets with the steady rhythm of someone who has already forgotten he is in the room. And here is the thing you need to understand about that refusal, because it was a refusal, wrapped in courtesy so thorough it functioned as a locked door. Maggie Flood had spent 7 years, 7 years of mended cuffs and counted candles and bread stretched to last one more day, refusing to be made into a thing, a charity case, a curiosity, a poor woman improved by the attention of a wealthy man. She knew what happened when you let a rich person do something for you. The gift went into a ledger you never saw, and the balance came due in ways you never agreed to. And by the time you understood the terms, you owed something you could not name, and could not repay. So she said thank you, and she said the chair was mended, and she did not pick up the brass thimble from her apron pocket to turn between her fingers, because her fingers were already busy with sheets that smelled of lavender and careful storage. And Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Calverley, stood there with his gray-green eyes and his rehearsed generosity, and understood, dimly, irritatingly, that he had been dismissed. He did not take it well, not outwardly. Outwardly he was perfectly composed, his dark chestnut hair swept back, the plain gold signet ring catching the morning light as he clasped his hands behind his back. But over the next 2 days, Edmund began finding reasons to be in whatever room Maggie was working in.
He appeared in the still room while she was labeling jars. He materialized in the pantry during her weekly accounting of the flour and sugar. He stationed himself in the library with a book he was not reading while she polished the grate. He told himself he was studying the household management. He told himself this with the absolute conviction of a man who has never once in his life studied household management. Lady Phoebe watched all of this from her chair by the fire, pince-nez perched on her narrow aquiline nose, her ivory-handled walking stick resting across her knees. She watched him trail from room to room like a tall, well-dressed shadow. She watched Maggie ignore him with an efficiency that bordered on art. And on the second afternoon, when Edmund passed through the morning room for the 3rd time in an hour, Phoebe said, to no one in particular, to the air itself, to the small round birthmark on her own cheekbone reflected in the window, "A man who follows a woman from room to room is either a bailiff or in love, and bailiffs do not blush." Edmund's jaw tightened. The faint coppery freckles across the bridge of his nose disappeared into a flush of color, and he left the room without a word. Phoebe smiled into her shawls, all 3 of them, plum over charcoal over cream, and did not elaborate. Then came the moment that changed everything, though Edmund would not recognize it as such for weeks. A stranger arrived at the kitchen door late on the Thursday afternoon. A discharged soldier, thin, road-worn, his coat too large for the frame beneath it, his boots split at the sole. He asked for work. Not food, not charity. Work. And Maggie had no work to give him and no money to pay for it, because the household ran on £11 a year and every shilling of it was already spoken for. She fed him anyway. Bread, cheese, a cup of ale drawn from the cask she rationed by the half-pint, a chair by the fire, not the mended one, but a solid one pulled close to the warmth. And she asked his name and where he was going and how long he had served, as though he were a guest and not a beggar, as though he were a man and not a problem to be managed. She did this without performance, without an audience, without knowing that Edmund Ashworth stood in the shadowed hall behind the half-open door, watching a woman who could not afford her own carpenter give away food she could not replace. This is the moment the Duke of Calverley began to fall. He did not know it yet, and when he did know it, it would be too late to stop. That evening he went to Lady Phoebe. He asked about Maggie's situation, carefully, the way a man prods a wound to learn its depth. Phoebe told him in blunt, numbered terms. Flood Cottage, the home Maggie grew up in, was lost when her father borrowed £200 from a man named George Pallister at 12% interest to repair a failing roof. The debt compounded. Pallister foreclosed. He now rented the cottage to a tenant for £30 a year, 6 times what the debt service would have been under fair terms. Phoebe's pale blue eyes were sharp as cut glass behind her pince-nez. "He is patient and smiling and reasonable," she said, "which is what makes it cruelty." 3 days later, Mr. George Pallister arrived at Hartlow for what he called a social visit. He came in a good coat, sandy blonde hair combed flat with pomade, his gold pocket watch consulted twice before he crossed the threshold. He was pleasant. He was well tailored, soft through the middle but cleverly cut to disguise it. He greeted Maggie with a warmth that made Edmund's skin crawl, a warmth like a thumb pressing slowly into a bruise. How well she looked, how admirably she managed. How remarkable it was, really, that she kept things running on so very little. Every compliment a reminder of what she lacked. Every smile a measurement of how much she could bear without flinching.
Maggie's hands went still for the first time Edmund had ever seen. She set the brass thimble down on the table and did not pick it up again until he leaves. The door closed behind Pallister, and the silence he left was not the comfortable kind. It was the silence of a room that had been holding its breath, and Edmund stood in it with his hands clasped behind his back, his gray-green eyes fixed on the place where Maggie's fingers rested flat against the tabletop, motionless, the brass thimble lying on its side beside her palm like a small, abandoned thing. He asked her directly, no preamble, no circling the question with the polite geometry that men of his rank usually employed when they wanted to know something ugly. "What does Pallister want from you?" And Maggie Flood, who had not looked up from the table, lifted her dark brown eyes and answered with a single sentence that landed like a verdict read in a courtroom where the judge has already made up his mind. "He wants me to need him, sir. That is what men like that always want." Damn. Just damn. She told him the rest without flinching. 3 times Pallister had come to Flood Cottage with his gold pocket watch catching the light and his soft body angled forward like a man leaning into a doorway he hasn't been invited through. 3 times he had offered to forgive the remaining debt on her cottage, every last shilling of the 11 pounds 4 shillings she still owed, in exchange for her agreement to manage his household at Pallister Hall. Not as a servant, mind you. He was very careful about that. As a companion. As an arrangement. As something that had no honest name, because giving it an honest name would have made the ugliness of it impossible to smile through. She would live under his roof. She would eat at his table when no company was present, and vanish to the back stairs when company arrived. She would be visible to him at all hours and invisible to everyone who mattered, and she would owe him everything. Her bread, her warmth, her walls, without the protection of a contract or the dignity of a wage. Owned in everything but law. She had refused each time. And here is the pivot. Here is the thing that turns a single man's cruelty into something architectural. Pallister had not stopped at Maggie. Over the past 18 months, quietly, patiently, with the pleasant smile of a man discussing weather, George Pallister had been buying up small debts across the parish. The farrier owed him £9 for a loan taken during a bad winter. The curate's widow owed him £6 against her late husband's unpaid subscription to a book society Pallister himself had founded. The woman who sold eggs at the crossroads owed him £2 8 shillings for seed stock advanced the previous spring. Each debt was small, each debtor was decent, and each one, when pressed, would remember that Maggie Flood had refused the generous Mr. Pallister's generous offer, and would begin, slowly, without malice, because desperation does not require malice, to withdraw the small courtesies that made her life in the village possible. The neighbor who let her draw water from his well, The farmer who sold her flour at a fair price. The woman who watched her hives when Maggie walked to town for thread. Small noise. Small, patient, smiling noise. Catastrophic failure. Because that is how men like Pallister work. They do not swing a fist. They tighten a web, strand by strand, and they smile while they do it. And when the woman at the center finally cannot breathe, they offer her air and call it kindness. Edmund's fury, when it came, was not loud. It was the fury of a man who has spent years among people who perform generosity for applause and has just been shown the mirror image. Cruelty performed with the same showmanship, the same careful staging, the same expectation of gratitude.
He paced the length of the study at Hartlow with his dark chestnut hair catching the last of the afternoon light, his plain gold signet ring catching nothing, and the faint birthmark on his neck flushing darker than the rest of his skin. Lady Phoebe watched him from her chair, 3 shawls layered like argument, her ivory-handled walking stick resting against her knee. "You are angry," she said, one sparse white brow lifted, "because you have discovered that money can be used as a weapon, which is something every woman in this county learned before she was 20. That sentence sat in the air like a slap he deserved. He found Maggie in the garden at dusk. She was tending her beehives, the 3 battered skeps she had carried from Flood Cottage to continue her work while she managed Hartlow's kitchen. And she moved among them with the calm, unhurried competence of a woman who had long ago made peace with the fact that the only creatures in the world who repaid her labor honestly were insects. Her honey-blonde hair was escaping its twist at the temples. Her faded sage-green dress was dusted with pollen at the cuffs. She did not look up when he approached, but she knew he was there because she angled her body just slightly to keep the hive's flight path clear of him. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the tiny crescent birthmark at the corner of her right eyebrow, too far to reach her. "Is there anything I can do?" he said, and it was not a question so much as a surrender. She looked at him then, really looked for the first time, her dark brown eyes steady and direct and utterly without illusion. The brass thimble was back in her hand, turning slowly between her fingers. "You are kind, sir, but kindness from a man of rank is a loan, and I cannot afford the interest." Neither of them moved. Neither of them touched. The evening air between them held the scent of warm wax and late lavender, and it was, for exactly 4 heartbeats, the most charged silence Edmund Ashworth had ever stood inside. That night he sat at the writing desk in Hartlow's study with a single candle and wrote to his solicitor in London. The instructions were precise. Purchase the mortgage on Flood Cottage from Pallister at whatever price is required. Restore the freehold. Do it anonymously. His pen moved with the certainty of a man who believes he is solving a problem rather than creating one. He believed he was doing the right thing. He believed he was not buying her. Lady Phoebe read the letter over his shoulder. She had absolutely no shame about reading other people's correspondence, never had, never would. And when she finished, she set her pince-nez back against her chest and told him, in a voice as flat and final as a coffin lid, that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. "You are about to do for her what she has spent 7 years refusing to let any man do. You are about to make her a gift she did not ask for, from a man whose name will be on the deed whether you write it there or not. And when she finds out, and she will find out, because she is cleverer than you, she will not thank you. She will shut the door." He sent the letter anyway. That is the thing about a man who has spent 34 years having his decisions confirmed by silence and obedience. He mistakes the absence of resistance for the presence of wisdom. Edmund sealed the envelope, handed it to the Morning Post, and told himself that Lady Phoebe, for all her years and all her sharpness, did not understand the situation as he did. He was not buying Maggie Flood. He was removing an obstacle. There was a difference, he insisted, between purchasing a woman and purchasing her freedom, and the fact that he could not quite articulate that difference aloud should have told him everything. It told him nothing. And so the next 10 days unfolded with a fragile, deepening warmth between him and Maggie that was built entirely on a lie he had not yet told.
They settled into a routine at Hardlow, the way two careful people will when proximity has become unavoidable and neither is willing to name why they have stopped trying to avoid it. Edmund helped with the accounts, not because he was the Duke of Calverley, not because he commanded it, not because Maggie asked, but because she discovered, on the third evening, that he could add a column of figures in his head faster than she could on paper, and she was practical enough to use any tool that worked. That was the word she used, tool. He should not have found it as thrilling as he did. They ate meals at the same scarred oak table. They argued about the cost of beeswax. She said 4 halfpenny the pound from the chandler in Mardley. He said she was being robbed and could get it for 3 if she bought in quantity. She told him that buying in quantity required capital she did not have, and that perhaps he had heard of poverty. It was quite common outside of London. He opened his mouth, closed it. She won. They argued about ledger keeping. She used a system of her own devising involving small crosses and half-moons in the margins that he called illegible and she called efficient. They argued about the east chimney, which was crumbling from the second course up, and whether it could be repaired for under £2. He said it could not. She said it could if one did the labor oneself and purchased only the lime and the sand. He asked if she intended to climb a chimney. She asked if he intended to stop her. These arguments were the best conversations of Edmund's life, and he knew it. And knowing it frightened him in a way that no creditor and no battlefield ever had. Because Maggie never yielded. She never deferred. She never once softened her position because a man of £11,000 a year held the opposite view, and the complete absence of that particular performance, that simpering, that theatrical capitulation he had watched women execute in every drawing room from Bath to Belgravia, left him standing on ground he did not recognize. One evening, reaching for the same ledger at the same moment, her hand brushed his. Both of them went completely still. Neither spoke. The tallow candle on the table guttered once and steadied. Maggie's fingers rested against the edge of his knuckle, just there, just barely, the warmth of living skin against living skin. And Edmund looked down at her hand, small, calloused at the heel of the palm, ink-stained at the fingertip of her index finger where she held her pen too close to the nib. The brass thimble was in her apron pocket. He could see its faint round outline pressing against the cloth. He did not take her hand. 4 seconds, maybe 5. An eternity dressed in nothing. The restraint cost him more than any fortune he had ever spent, and he would have paid it twice over for another 4 seconds of not touching her, because the not touching had become the truest thing in his life, more honest than his title, more real than the signet ring worn smooth on his right hand, more valuable than the £340 his solicitor was, at that very moment, counting out to purchase a debt that was not his to buy. Maggie withdrew her hand first, picked up the ledger, opened it to the page with her small crosses and half moons, said nothing. Edmund said nothing. Lady Phoebe, who had been watching from her chair by the fire, 3 shawls deep, pince-nez glinting, ivory-handled walking-stick resting against her knee, said nothing either, but she raised one sparse white brow in a way that communicated entire volumes. Later that night, when Maggie had gone upstairs, the old woman delivered her verdict, one pale blue eye fixed on her great-nephew, the cameo brooch at her throat catching the last of the firelight. "She is not performing for you, Edmund. That is why you cannot look away."
Every woman you have ever known has been auditioning for the role of Duchess, and this one does not even know the theater exists. That is either the most liberating thing in the world or the most terrifying, and I suspect for you, it is both. Edmund said nothing to that either, because there was nothing to say that would not prove her right.
3 days later, the solicitor's reply arrived. A folded letter on cream stock, sealed with brown wax. The mortgage on Flood Cottage had been purchased for £340. The debt was now held in the name of the Calverley estate. Maggie owed nothing to George Pallister. She owed everything, though she did not know it yet, to the man sitting across from her at breakfast, buttering bread and pretending his hands were steady. Edmund held that letter and felt, for the first time, a flicker of doubt, not about the act itself, but about the silence wrapped around it. He buried the doubt the way one buries a coal that is not quite dead, shoved it down, pressed earth over it. That coal was still burning when George Pallister's carriage pulled into the yard at Hartlow 10 days after the letter was sent. Pallister stepped down from the carriage looking exactly like himself, which is to say, sandy hair combed flat with pomade, pale hazel eyes blinking with that attentive calculation, a gold pocket watch consulted ostentatiously before he even reached the door. Smiling. Always smiling. The man smiled the way other men breathed, constantly, involuntarily, and with absolutely no warmth behind it. He had the sale documents in his hand. He presented them to Maggie in the front room, in front of Edmund, in front of Lady Phoebe, in front of the household, with the air of a man delivering a gift he had not paid for, which was precisely what he was doing. "I understand your cottage is to be restored to you, Mrs. Flood. How fortunate that His Grace has taken such an interest in your welfare. One does so love to see a woman of your circumstances find herself a generous patron. It gives one faith in the natural order." He said it warmly. He said it pleasantly. He said it the way a man presses his thumb slowly into a bruise and asks if it hurts. Maggie's face went white. Not red. White. The honey-blonde wisps at her temples seemed suddenly darker against skin that had lost every trace of color. The tiny crescent birthmark at the corner of her right eyebrow stood out like a scar. She turned to Edmund, and the expression on her face was not anger, it was not hurt. It was the specific, terrible recognition of a woman who had believed, genuinely, deeply, with the whole weight of a pride she had built from wreckage, that she had found someone who saw her as a person, and who had just discovered, in a single smiling sentence from a man she despised, that she had been a project all along. Maggie sets the brass thimble on the table, looks at Edmund and says, "You bought it." 2 words, no question mark. The flattest, most final sentence he has ever heard. And behind her,
Still standing in the doorway of Flood Cottage with those sale documents folded neatly in his soft fingers, Pallister has the decency— no, not decency. Pallister has never had decency. Pallister has the theatrical instinct to say nothing further. He has delivered his little grenade. He can afford to watch it detonate in silence, wait on his toes, that garnet cravat pin catching the light, the gold pocket watch chain swaying gently against his waistcoat, like a pendulum measuring out the seconds of someone else's ruin. And Maggie does not shout. That is the thing Edmund will remember for the rest of his life, the thing that will sit behind his ribs like a shard of glass for years to come. She does not shout. She does not weep. She speaks in short, precise sentences that land like closing arguments in a courtroom where the verdict has already been decided and the judge is merely reading it into the record for posterity.
You bought it. You did not ask me. You decided what I needed, and you provided it. And now my home has your name written into its history, and I did not consent to that. Edmund opens his mouth. His gray-green eyes are wide, and the faint coppery freckles across the bridge of his nose stand out sharp against skin that has gone pale beneath its ruddy undertone. He tries to explain, something about Pallister's pressure, the threat of eviction, the 40 pounds arrears she could not have cleared in 3 seasons of sewing and beekeeping and teaching. She cuts him off. I have spent 7 years refusing to be owned, sir. 7 years. And you have undone it in a single letter, because you could not bear to watch me mend my own chair. 1 sentence, and it levels him. Not because she is wrong, but because she is exactly, devastatingly, completely right. The Duke of Calverley, who commands an income of £11,000 a year, who holds 4 estates and 40 empty beds, and a name that opens every door in 3 counties, this man has done precisely what Pallister did, only with better intentions and a larger purse. He made her life his to fix. He treated her independence as a problem to be solved, rather than a choice to be respected. The wound his stepmother gave him, that old deep lesson that performed affection is currency, that love is a transaction dressed in silk, has taught him the wrong counter-lesson. He learned that he can only show love by spending, by providing, by making the world safe through purchase. And Maggie, who has built a whole life out of wreckage by answering to no one, who keeps bees and sews for shillings and feeds strangers at her own table from a pot that barely feeds herself, Maggie cannot accept love delivered in that shape. Because love in that shape looks exactly like a cage with a nicer lock. Pallister, behind her, consults his pocket watch. Just a glance. Just a small, satisfied glance. Because this is what men like Pallister do. They don't need to win. They just need everyone else to lose. From the corner of the room, in the old chair by the hearth, the mended one, the one with the leg Edmund himself repaired weeks ago without being asked, which now feels less like a kindness and more like an exhibit in a trial, Lady Phoebe Ashworth lifts her ivory-handled walking stick and taps it once against the floor. Her pale blue eyes, sharp as broken glass beneath those sparse white brows, fix on her great-nephew. 3 shawls, plum, charcoal, cream, layered like armor around her thin shoulders. "I told you, Edmund." Her voice is quiet, devastating. "She is not a leaking roof. You cannot repair her with money and then expect her to be grateful for the scaffolding." The walking stick taps again, once. "You must give the cottage back to her with no conditions, and then you must leave. And then you must see if she ever opens the door to you again. That is the only honest thing left. And here is where Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Calverley, does the hardest thing he has ever done in 34 years of careful, measured, controlled living. He does what Lady Phoebe tells him. Not because she commands it, but because he recognizes truth when it finally stops whispering and starts speaking plainly. He instructs his solicitor, by letter that same evening, in handwriting that does not waver because he will not allow it to waver, to transfer the freehold of Flood Cottage to Margaret Flood directly. No lien, no obligation, no reversion clause, no connection to the Calverley estate. Her name, her property, her ground beneath her feet, belonging to no one but her. He signs the deed of release. He places it on the kitchen table of Flood Cottage the following morning, beside the brass thimble she left there. He does not ask her to read it in front of him. He does not wait for gratitude. He walks out. And then Edmund prepares to leave Hartlow.
The narrator, that's me, would like you to understand what that looks like, because it matters. It looks like a man folding his shirts with the same precise, courteous motions he uses for everything, placing his shaving kit in his case, pulling the dark charcoal tailcoat from the wardrobe and brushing it with 3 economical strokes. But his hands are not steady, and his jaw is set in that compressed line that his mouth defaults to, only harder now, locked. The plain gold signet ring on his right hand catches the light as he buckles the case, its crest worn nearly illegible by years of unconscious turning. And for the first time in this entire story, the Duke of Calverley looks like a man who has lost something he cannot buy back. Rain starts in the afternoon. Heavy, steady, English rain. The kind that turns lanes to mud and makes sensible men stay indoors. Edmund rides to Flood Cottage anyway. He dismounts at the gate. He does not open it. The water runs down his chestnut hair and into the collar of his coat, darkening it, and he stands there, military straight, hands at his sides instead of clasped behind his back, because for once he is not holding himself together. Maggie opens the door. He does not enter. He does not step forward. He stands outside Flood Cottage in the rain, having given up every power he has ever held, rank, money, pride, the ability to not be refused, and asks Maggie one question that is not a question, but an offering. Tell me what you want, and I will do it. And if what you want is for me to leave, I will do that too. Maggie stands in the doorway of Flood Cottage, rain falling behind Edmund, and does not answer him for a long time. Long enough for the water to soak through the shoulders of his charcoal wool tailcoat and darken it to something close to black. Long enough for the mud to creep over the soles of those tall black leather riding boots, polished that morning to a dull shine by hands that were not his own. Long enough for him to understand, really understand in the marrow of him, that her silence is not cruelty, but the sound of a woman deciding whether to trust again. And he does not move. He does not repeat himself. He does not bargain. He stands there with his 11,000 a year and his 40 empty rooms and his plain gold signet ring worn smooth on his right hand, and he waits for a woman who earns £18 a year to decide his future. The narrator would like you to sit with that. Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Calverley, who has commanded regiments and dismissed ministers and walked through rooms that rearrange themselves around his presence like iron filings around a magnet, this man has never, not once in 34 years of living, submitted to another person's timeline. And the submission is not weakness. It is the hardest damn thing he has ever done. Maggie speaks.
She does not say yes. She does not say no. She says, "Come inside before you ruin those boots. They cost more than I earn in a year, and I will not have that on my conscience." It is the first joke she has ever made to him, and it breaks something open in both of them, something that had been held shut by formality and suspicion and the terrible weight of what had almost been lost. His gray-green eyes blink. His narrow mouth, that perpetual compressed line, does something it has almost never done in her presence. It curves. And Edmund Ashworth steps through the door of Flood Cottage, and the rain keeps falling behind him, and nobody is rescued. Inside, by the fire, with the brass thimble turning between her fingers in her apron pocket, Maggie tells him what she wants. Not what she'll accept, not what she's willing to settle for. What she wants. And here it is, plain as a ledger entry. She wants Flood Cottage. She wants her bees, all 12 hives of them. She wants to keep her own accounts in her own hand.
She wants her Tuesday letters to the women she's taught, and she wants those women to keep coming to her kitchen table. And she wants no servant to answer her door who did not grow up within 5 miles of it. She wants to be chosen as herself, Margaret Flood, who mends chairs and feeds strangers and earns her own bread. Or not at all. She is not a thing to be improved. She is not a project. She is not the living correction to a painted face in a locket. She is a woman with ink on her fingers and a life she built from wreckage, and that life is sufficient. And if he cannot meet her inside it, he is welcome to ride back to his 40 rooms and fill them with silence. Edmund listens. He does not offer to improve a single thing. He asks if he may come back tomorrow. She says he may. And that, dear listener, is the entire foundation. 2 words. He may. Now, Pallister. Let's finish with George Pallister, that smiling, soft-bodied, pomade-slicked nothing of a man who spent years pressing on Maggie's poverty the way a child presses on a bruise, gently, patiently, with that attentive blink and those pale hazel eyes calculating the precise amount of pressure required to make her flinch without making her scream. With the freehold restored and the deed in Maggie's name, Pallister has nothing left to hold. Edmund's solicitor calls in every small debt Pallister accumulated across the parish, face value, every penny, no profit, no leverage. Just the money returned and the chain dissolved. Pallister comes to Hartlow one final time, smiling, pleasant, reasonable, consulting that gold pocket watch on its heavy chain as though time itself still belonged to him. And Lady Phoebe meets him at the door, all 5 feet of her. 3 shawls, plum, charcoal, cream, pinned with the cameo at her throat. Ivory-handled walking stick pointed directly at his chest, those pale blue eyes sharp as glass above the round birthmark on her right cheekbone. She says, "Mr. Pallister, you have been made unnecessary. I cannot think of a more fitting end for a man whose only skill was making himself indispensable to people who had no choice." He leaves. He does not return. And the narrator will not waste another syllable on him. The courtship takes a year. A full year conducted almost entirely at Flood Cottage and in Maggie's world, not Edmund's. He learns to check the hives. He learns the name of every woman Maggie teaches. He mends a fence badly, and she does not fix it for him. She lets it stand crooked for 3 months until he figures out the post hole himself. The single kiss comes on a December evening when frost has silvered the garden,
and the fire has burned low, and Maggie places one hand, her thimble still in her pocket, her ink still on her fingers, the tiny crescent birthmark at the corner of her right eyebrow catching the light, against his cheek, and presses her mouth to his once, briefly, with her dark brown eyes open. It is worth every silent mile he ever rode away from her door. They marry. Maggie does not become the Duchess of Calverley in any way that changes who she is. Flood Cottage remains hers, in her name, separate from the estate. She keeps her bees. She keeps her ledger. She keeps her Tuesday letters. Years later, two graying heads bent over a ledger at the kitchen table of Flood Cottage, which has never been renamed, never been absorbed into the Calverley estate, and still keeps 12 hives. The brass thimble sits beside the inkwell. The gold signet ring, worn smoother now, taps the page. The mended chair, the one she fixed herself on her knees at midnight years ago, still holds. The hard years are not erased. The stepmother, the debt, the 7 years of silence, the forged letter that should never have been sent. All of it remains, folded into the grain of the life they built. But it is no longer the whole of the story.
And in the kitchen of Flood Cottage, in the late afternoon light, Margaret Flood turns the page of the ledger, and the Duke of Calverley hands her the pen. And neither of them is anyone else, and that, at last, is enough.